Welcome to Watchtower History. All right, and so we're going to look at now how Watchtower viewed Henry Ford in some of these articles. Because this is during the same time period. So the Golden Age for May 30th, 1926 shows that Watchtower was following Ford and the Dearborn Independent. And this is 1926, after Ford's anti-Semitism is very well known. Right? And what does it say here? Henry Ford believes in giving old men a chance. In one factory, he has at work 91 men aged from 70 to 88 years. A writer in the Dearborn Independent says that the greatest dread of these men is not death, but the inability to continue their daily work. And so they are quoting here the Dearborn Independent.
And I'd like to add here, too, Ford did do a lot of philanthropy. He did a lot of good things, so you hate to just mark against him one aspect of his life. He did give, was very generous. And in fact, his whole philosophy on paying, I don't want to make something my employees can't afford to buy themselves. So a lot of what people don't realize, a lot of employees from General Motors and other in Detroit, in the Detroit area and all that, they were wanting to go work for Ford. He actually put quite a labor problem upon the other auto manufacturers, and the small ones went out of business. But he created a labor problem for other people because he paid his employees so well. So he did do a lot of good, but that doesn't cancel out or negate what his main purpose in life was, so to say.
And remember, Rutherford wasn't the editor of the Golden Age. That was Clayton Woodworth at the time. And so you'll find in Watchtower literature that Rutherford wasn't the only one guilty of taking these anti-Semitic ideas or taking these Ford ideas and incorporating them into the newspapers. And so one, I think, very silly example is the example of jazz music.
About the time that the first blast furnaces at the Rouge were being fired, Henry Ford again offered the world his thinking. But this time his thinking was tainted by anti-Semitism.
Anti-Semitism was very common in the farm communities of the Midwest at the end of the last century. It went with mistrust of the East, of the banking system, all sorts of things like this. And Henry Ford's prejudices were those of an ordinary Midwest farmer. The tragedy of it was that he had the money and the conceit to put his ideas on paper and actually publish his own magazine, which spread it all around America and, of course, made him a laughingstock.
Through the Dearborn Independent, Ford blamed the Jewish people for everything from World War to short skirts, cheap movies, and jazz music. It wasn't until he faced a libel suit, public disapproval, and the continued pleas of friends that Henry Ford tendered an apology. But there were those who doubted the sincerity of that apology. In July 1938, Ford accepted Germany's Grand Cross, the highest honor the Third Reich could bestow on a foreigner.
It's really quite fascinating that Henry Ford fixated on Jews and made them responsible for every evil that he saw going on in the country, whether it was changes in baseball or music.
So week after week, for 90 weeks, is the theory of the protocols applied to baseball, jazz, theater, film, prohibition, cigarettes, newfangled forms of dance, every cultural hallmark of the 1920s that Ford personally abhors.
But the reason you were taught to square dance in your elementary, middle, or even high school gym class was actually to fight the Jews who were the masterminds behind jazz? Wait a minute. What? Nostalgia. Under the microscope. The reason many of us learn to roll away to a half sachet is entirely the fault of Henry Ford, the founder of the Ford Motor Company and very notably a well-documented anti-Semite. In the 1920s, he had his own newspaper called the Dearborn Independent that was later reprinted in the overtly anti-Semitic International Jew newspaper. If that isn't enough proof, he was additionally celebrated by Hitler and even praised in Mein Kampf. Later, he denied writing the articles and then also half-heartedly apologized for writing them, which, in that order, happens to be taken right out of a guilty person's playbook. Unsurprisingly, this old, rich, white guy thought jazz and all the new dances of the time were going to completely destroy America. So you're probably thinking, wait, why'd he try to combat jazz with square dancing when Jewish people didn't have anything to do with jazz? And you'd be right. Ford believed that the Jews were actually manipulating the African American community into creating this new enticing style of music and culture to destroy and take over the world, which is absolutely insane. It's like the inception of racism. Tap the rock in your pocket twice if you think you're caught in a racist fever dream. I've never actually seen Inception. I kept falling asleep through it, which is actually the way you're supposed to do it, so.
That's enough.
So Ford, aka adult man actually scared of a type of music, decided to uphold white people culture by trying to make old-fashioned dancing a thing again, which is coded language for upholding whiteness through dance, which, to be fair, worked pretty well for DDR. And well, frankly, unlike your bedridden grandma, Ford actually had the money to do it. So he poured money into strongly recommending, aka throwing cash at, square dancing being taught around the country, as well as attempting to bring back other historically white dances like the waltz and the French quadrille. He poured even more money into this weird and racist cause by purchasing a violin for $75,000 so he could teach himself the music and bring square dancing back to life by the power of his own dumb little fingers. Money gets you pretty far pretty much always, so eventually he even bought into school curriculums, petitioning and supplying money for programs under the guise of it being a wholesome dance to keep the kids on the right path.
Henry Ford hated jazz music. He called it Jewish jazz. He said, Jewish jazz becomes our national music. He says, why France demands jazz? The jazz generation. He called jazz jungle music. And so we see in the Golden Age and the Enterprise, where they also mention jazz music. So the Golden Age of November 4th, 1925 has an article, The Survival of the Unfit. And it says, to stimulate its waning energies and preserve its youthful masquerade, modern civilization has recourse to beauty doctors, reducings, dietings, rapid motion, narcotics, and jazz. Jazz has been stigmatized as jungle music, epitomizing the soul of the underman, appealing to the passions rather than the higher emotions, rousing the animal nature in man at the cost of the spiritual. In verity, its jangle of discords seems sometimes reminiscent of jungle noises, combining the trumpeting of elephants with growling and snarling of carnivore and the grunting and squealing of wild pigs, and so on and so forth. It's just so bizarre.
You know what? I'm thinking of a few jazz songs. There is a lot of horns and elephant trumpets in there. But oh man, too funny.
All right, and so the New Era Enterprise, March 17th, 1925, has an article by Heatherly, J.W. Heatherly, Gleanings Along the Narrow Way. And towards the end, he says, we may be wrong about jazz music or bobbed hair. Still, we doubt it. So in the New Era Enterprise for August 18th, 1925, there's an article, Palestine looks like Boomtown. And of course, it's linking in the Jews with the jazz music, just like Ford did. It says, in one place, there was an attempt at dancing to American jazz music, but the dancers wear solemn faces, and the whole thing seems a bit of acting rather than reality. There is no amusement whatever in the evening. Residents eat late suppers, and then they go to bed. a sober and sad life, the American will say. And so some of the American Jews will find it so and want to return, yet the prevailing spirit of the place the traveler finds is optimism. And so remember, at that time, they had traveled to Palestine, and they were trying to suggest the idea that the Jews returning to Palestine was, a prophecy of God, and yet they're starting to spread these anti-Semitic ideas from Ford's paper, right? So they're doing two things at the same time, until just finally they just totally cast it off. So in the New Era Enterprise, November 14th, 1922, is an article on the front page. The World Has Ended by F. Leanne Shearer. And so Mr. Henry Ford of the Dearborn Independent fame, under the date of July 21st, concludes by saying, the new era is here, but that even Adventists have come to acknowledge this Russellite phrase may not be so genuinely known, hence a few excerpts quoted at random from their own publications may be worthy of passing notice. In an editorial headed A Prophetic Era, The World Crisis of Boston, dated 1915. Remember, this is not Seventh-day Adventists. This would be the Advent Christian denomination. You shouldn't be confused, two different things. So the World Crisis says, prophetic utterances of both Old and New Testaments are taking on a new meaning. The experience of lapsing civilization may involve the crushing of kingdoms or even the consummation of the present age. Adventists are not surprised. They have looked for such things and have predicted them for decades. And so they're following Ford for a long time here, right? Very, very interesting. So the Golden Age, May 24th, 1922, has an article, Branding the Undesirables by N.A. Eckerman. Not long ago, in conversation with a party of men, the Henry Ford proposition of taking over the Muscle Shoals came up. One of the party called Mr. Ford a vile name, stating that men who try to upset precedents which have been in vogue for years are nothing but Bolshevists and socialists. The conversation opened up a line of thought. So again, they're following Ford, and they're mentioning, again, this conspiracy of the Bolshevists and the socialists.
Right in the Golden Age, a Watchtower publication.
The March 15th, 1933 Golden Age has an article, Clergy Crawl into Their Holes. So the following article, entitled The Challenge from the Anglo-Saxon Federation of America Bulletin for December 1932, is really pathetic because of its admission that the most capable ministers in the Anglo-Saxon Federation are afraid to meet Judge Rutherford in a worldwide radio debate as to whether or not the clergy are the clergy of the devil. The judge insists that they are, and the silence of the big guns among the clergy and of the organizations with which they are connected is tacit admission that they know their best and only defense is to crawl into their holes and put the holes in after them, as is done in the following article. But it's interesting because this Anglo-Saxon Federation of America, and we'll get into that a little later on, one of the founders of that white supremacist group was the writer and editor of Henry Ford's Dearborn Independent. So we'll get into that in just a little bit.
What else I get out of this when you put some of the timing together of all this? Okay, Rutherford is looking at everybody, challenging him to debates. But reality, by that time, 33, he lost all credibility. I mean, Time magazine had him listed as a California cult. They're like not avoiding him because they're afraid of him. They're like, he's irrelevant. Nobody's, it's almost to the point where you associate in a realm of celebrity, you don't associate with someone who's going to tar your image, mar your image. So my take on it is these people are more avoiding him rather than not wanting to debate him. It's like what he's got to say is irrelevant. And again, I'm going to point back to the Time magazine article on him, California cults. He was considered a cult leader with strange ideas.
But I think at that time, the word cult had a different significance to it than it does today. I think it
Yeah.
was more short for culture. So a Christian culture, a Christian.
Okay, I'm
cult.
using that term.
Yeah.
I'm not saying
Yeah.
it's still. I think he was by that time.
But he was singled out in,
Yeah, he was kind of irrelevant. It's
he's
like
singled out as being, as eccentric.
It's. I don't think they found a purpose to waste their time to deal with him.
And of course they saw him as eccentric because they're talking about his Besserim and waiting for the prophets to arrive. Yeah. Interesting. The March 15th, 1933 Golden Age has an article called Clergy Crawl Into Their Holes. They are reprinting an article from the white supremacist Anglo-Saxon Federation of America from December 1932. And they say that it's really pathetic because of its admission that the most capable ministers in the Anglo-Saxon Federation are afraid to meet Judge Rutherford in a worldwide radio debate as to whether or not the clergy are of the devil. The judge insists that they are, and the silence of the big guns among the clergy and of the organizations with which they are connected is tacit admission that they know their best, and only defense is to crawl into their holes and put the holes in after them, as is done in the following article. And then there's a subheading here, a challenge. And this is the article. It's a shame that the pastors in Israel are not equipped to meet the attacks of Mr. J.F. Rutherford, as he denounces them and all governments and rule. In a paper distributed by his followers, a challenge is issued to the clergy of America for debate. Jeremiah 51:30 is quoted in the circular and applied to the pastors in Israel. But the prophet is here speaking of Babylon. Mr. Rutherford is deliberately misquoting scripture or is totally ignorant of the context from which the verse has been lifted. The reference to the Medes in the 28th verse certainly identifies the Babylon in this verse. Neither is there any justification for applying the historical happenings in Babylon to latter-day events in Israel. To thus cross wires brings utter confusion. Let the things of Babylon testify of Babylon, but let the things of Israel testify to the happenings among his kingdom people. This particular chapter of Jeremiah contains valuable information. Let Mr. Rutherford declare what is the portion of Jacob and the rod of his inheritance in verse 19. In the same chapter, the Lord says of Israel, "Thou art my battle axe and weapons of war. For with thee I will break in pieces the nations, and with thee I will destroy kingdoms." Let him show where, when, how, and by whom has all this been accomplished, without spiritualizing away the plain meaning of God's word. Let him declare the literal fulfillment of these statements. Ignorance of the whereabouts of the kingdom people, failing to misunderstand the distinction between Israel and Judah and the separate prophecies to each, with the resulting diversified fulfillments, he and his followers, as well as the organized church, are stone blind to 9/10 of the scripture. Because of their blindness, they are forced to spiritualize what they are unable to understand. Mr. Rutherford declares that his purpose in challenging the clergy of America to debate is that the people may know the truth. He assumes the silence on the part of the ministry is admission of their inability to meet in debate. Shall we assume the same regarding him? We challenge that in his teaching, he misrepresents scripture to attain his end, that he does not know or recognize the kingdom, and that in his spiritualization of the recorded, prophetical, and historical facts of scripture, he makes the Bible of no effect in the twisting and turning of its plain meaning into fantastical interpretations. We wonder if he really means he desires that the people shall know the truth, or only his version of the truth. Does he confine his challenge to those whom he knows will not answer, or will he extend it to others who will be glad to meet him in debate? So remember, this is a quotation of an article about Rutherford in a white supremacist magazine, and is talking about Rutherford's interpretations. And it's interesting because the argument they're making about Rutherford is that he was using the scriptures about a latter-day regathering of Israel, which is what Rutherford was doing, in the 1930s, this replacement theology. But they're doing the same thing by saying, this Anglo-Israelite regathering is a latter-day fulfillment fulfilled in America and Britain, and that they are these tribes, and it's its own type of replacement theology. And in this article is a subheading, and the subheading asks the question, what the Anglo-Israelites believe. And so this white supremacist group was part of this British Israelite movement or Anglo-Israelite movement. And it says here, we have just glanced over some of the recent literature of the Anglo-Israelites and list some of the items that some of them believe. All of these things look like nonsense, sacrilege, or blasphemy to us, but they seem reasonable enough to those who are inoculated with the idolatry of the British Empire. We present the matter merely as news and showing what some people can believe about the most rapacious, most diabolical, most hypocritical diplomatic government now left standing on the earth. And so among believers of this theory are Henry Ford. And of course, if it's the Anglo-Saxon Federation, that was the writer of Ford's materials in the Dearborn Independent. And of course, they're going to have a similar ideology. Those are the ideas that Ford's trying to push. But it says the Anglo-Saxon peoples are, in large measure, direct descendants of the apostate 10 tribes of Israel. So there's a literal replacement theology going on by Ford, by the writer of Ford's articles in the Independent, by this white supremacist group, by this racist group. And so they're all bringing this in. And so while Rutherford's trying to argue against their replacement theology, he's bringing his own replacement theology in at exactly the same time.
It's almost...
And both originating from Ford.
When you add all throughout everything he's come up with, Rutherford, that is, it seems like he really didn't come up with it on his own. He took everybody else's and thought he was making it better or something, because they're not his ideas entirely.
Yeah, entirely, yeah.
Entirely.
And so
he applied it to religion, as we'll get into.
Yeah, and so he has this idea that he's the chosen one because he's taking the lead of the organization. And he's got to replace the Jews so he can find more evidence that he's the chosen one. And so if you're looking for that kind of thing, and that kind of thing is out there in the zeitgeist of the culture, it's very easy to, that's what I'm looking for. And just grab the ideas that are out there because it supports the view that you've already got. And we're going to show, as we get a little further into Rutherford's history, that there was anti-Semitism going even further back during his political movement as well, during his political career. So we'll get into that in the future. Stay tuned. This golden age of March 28th, 1922, has an article called Henry Ford and the Prophets, and it rightfully places Henry Ford amongst these British Israelite replacement theology interpreters. But although the article argues against the Ford theory of replacement theology, it ends by introducing their own particular spiritual Israel replacement theology by stating, we wonder if even the Dearborn Independent can be ignorant of the fact that it is the line of the tribe of Judah, our Lord Jesus, that is the light of the world, the true light that eventually will lighten every man that ever came into the world. John 1:9. And I'll skip a little bit. As to the organization of spiritual Israel, it is enough for the Golden Age to know that the one highest in honor is in all that company of earth's future kings and priests is that same line of the tribe of Judah. And then we'll skip a little bit. Mr. Ford, we see no prophet, P-R-O-F-I-T, in your prophet, P-R-O-P-H-E-T. We refuse to take him seriously. But we will continue on and we'll take a look at how seriously they took Mr. Ford. The article continues. It is his great misfortune, and yours, that he takes himself seriously. If this helps to puncture his balloon, we're glad. If not, we give you both up to Abraham. Henry, we grant you high honors as an architect of rolling tin cans and scrap iron, but the prophecy business is not in your line. We would save you money, Henry. Goodbye. And so, again, as we said, we're going to look at more of these articles that talk about Henry Ford and Henry Ford's ideas. Stay tuned. So, the golden age of May 11th, 1921, there's an article called Henry Ford and the Jews. And this is by Newton T. Hartshorn. And we'll get a little bit into his history here in just a moment. But he's introducing his own Jewish conspiracies, including the Jewish banking conspiracies and the Rothschild family. The article starts by stating, hating the Jew is a fashion started by some people to sever their personal interests, the same as some people create a fad, a fashion, make money out of the fad, the fashion. But then he argues that the Jews hating Jesus, the Jew, were a part of the Jewish exploitation. The quote is, there were Jews who served their personal interests, started the fad, the fashion of hating Jesus, the Jew. This is the world's first pogrom. So he's blaming the Jews for persecuting the Jews.
Well, Vindication said the same thing.
Yeah, because a man
let God be true, right?
Yeah, let God be true. Yeah.
Said the same thing, and then they changed it.
All right, so there's another quote here. Because a man is a Jew, he's not different from other people. The same classification exists among Jews as among other people. There is no question, however, but that there is among Jews of today, are among so-called Christians, the antitypes of those scribes and Pharisees who stirred up the mob to ask Pilate to crucify Jesus as a seditionist. Is it not the Jew who joins with aristocratic imperialists that Henry Ford refers? I find this really reprehensible. Again, while he's praising the Jew in this article as being trained in the school of adversity, an environment of scorn, humiliation, stripped of his conceit to his superior ability, and as being prepared as the human agent for the great work of standing at the head in the regeneration of the human race, he then proceeds into the anti-Semitic conspiracies about the Jew in the Rothschild families. He continues stating the great Jewish capitalists have become conceited, exclusive aristocrats and imperialists who have lined up on the side of so-called Christians, imperialists, who by the aid of Jewish capital and brains expect to dominate the world on the old evil plan of selfish personal privilege of the few at the expense of the many. The British Rothschilds, Jews, are a part of the British church and state that plans to rule the world. And here's the worst part. What Henry Ford says about them is true, to my personal knowledge. I cannot believe this was published in the Golden Age, especially knowing what we know now about how these words were used to exterminate 6 million of them.
And I keep going back. You and I kind of differ on this. Yeah, maybe an article or two got by Rutherford. Rutherford had his grips on everything that went out in print. Yeah, and I agree with you. Once in a while, something might have slipped by, but articles like that weren't printed without his knowledge. Not like that. I could see an article on, something simple, non-doctrine related. We're doing a little story on I'm Zimbabwe, whatever. Yeah, okay, go ahead, run with it. But not stuff like that. I'm fully confident had his thumbs on articles like that came out of the Watchtower, especially in 1921. Through the 30s. He had full control obviously later, but that's quite a statement in there. They're literally agreeing with Ford fueling Hitler's ideas to exterminate the Jews. They're giving a blessing more or less with that.
reprehensible. And of course, in the early 1920s, they were not aware of what was going to happen. But,
No, and that's true. But what were the ideas of
yeah.
of that? It doesn't matter what the result of it. It's you're part of it, one way or another.
And so that quote continues. And what Henry Ford says about them is true, to my personal knowledge. They backed up the British imperialists in their diabolical plan to bring on the Civil War in America, split the United States into pieces, and absorb them into the British Empire. So now the Jews are being blamed for the Civil War in the Golden Age. So this Newton Hartshorn.
Do you think that's why Russell wanted an editorial committee of 5?
But remember how the Golden Age started. They had to do it outside of the Watchtower organization so they could publish what they wanted, and later it was brought in. But yeah, they had to be a little diabolical with that as well. But seeing the things they put in there, absolutely abhorrent, reprehensible, disgusting. The St. Paul Enterprise of November 27th, 1914, has an article by this Newton Hartshorn. And here again, even years before the Golden Age article, states, dining with one of the Rothschilds, the great banker, discussing American affairs, he said to me, "You do not have popular government in the United States. The people do not rule. Money rules." That set me to thinking, and I said to myself, is that the kind of government that millions of men spent their lives for in maintaining the American Union? I thought it over again and again. I was convinced that the old Baron knew what he was talking about, and knowing that their agent in New York was there and had been for many years chairman of the National Committee, one of our great political parties, I could trace out the connection. And so he's tracing the Rothschilds in, his Rothschild conspiracy in with the political movements in the United States.
And for memory, that's for confirmation, that's the same guy who wrote the Golden Age article, now writing for the St. Paul Enterprise, claiming he sat down with one of the Rothschilds. He was dining with one of the Rothschilds and is convinced now, based on what the Rothschild said, of his ideas.
All right, so we're going to get into the Rothschild thing a little bit later on, so stay tuned for that. But this Hartshorn wrote several articles in the Watchtower literature, in the Enterprise, and the Golden Age, during that period from 1914 to the early 1920s. Demon's subtlety invading ranks of the unwary.
And him, like Rutherford, the demons are attacking and behind it, in a big...
I think that was a common theme amongst the movement at the time period. Mm-hmm. Here's another one. Law and Order, Political, Domestic, and Foreign by Newton Hartshorn. A Polar Paradise Coming, November 24th, 1920, Golden Age. Everlasting Life on Earth by Newton Hartshorn, and this one says deceased. And it says and that was December 31st, 1924. So he had passed away before that. He was an elderly chap. And
an angry elderly chap.
This Hartshorn was quite the character. In his articles, he seems to always bump into all these famous people related to this Jewish question of relating to these Jewish conspiracies. In the St. Paul Enterprise article, After the War, What? And this is the April 18th, 1916 issue. Hartshorn tells a little story. He says, I was invited sometime since to hear Louis D. Brandeis, nominated by President Wilson for the U.S. Supreme Court, address 250 Jews in Harvard University on the subject of Jewish ethics and ideals. At his close, taking him by the hand, I said, Mr. Brandeis, from the standpoint of a radical Christian, I can see no difference between Jewish ethics and ideals and Christian ethics and ideals. Mr. Brandeis quickly replied, The ethics and ideals are all right, but it is their practical application that is needed. I responded emphatically, precisely, and Jesus came to institute an administration that had the power to practically apply them. Now, what exactly he meant by this, as a Christian talking to a Jewish person, we'll leave that to be interpreted. But Brandis was the first Jewish person elected to the Supreme Court in the United States of America. He campaigned for the election of President Wilson, and in 1916, Wilson asked him to sit on the Supreme Court. Now, Brandis was also a Zionist. He was looking for a new Jewish nation as a solution to the anti-Semitism that was rising around the world at the time, as a way to, quote, revive the Jewish spirit, unquote. So it's interesting that Hartshorn is repeating this story relating to some famous statements that Brandis had made. But Brandis was also involved in helping to create the Federal Reserve System. And that is another story that we'll get to in just a little bit. Stay tuned. All right, so in 1916, Hartshorn is bringing some of these ideas in. I think that they kind of later became a part of Watchtower theology, which was anti-President Wilson, kind of anti-America, anti-League of Nations, anti-United Nations. So in Hartshorn thinking in this article here, he's linking Antichrist to his view of prophecy. And he states, the Pope has lately congratulated the Protestant denominations on their efforts towards unity, urging that all Christians should be in unison. And we understand the Pope heading the so-called Christian world and proposing that President Wilson and the other heads of neutral nations unite with him to stop the war and bring peace upon the earth. Again,
He was this Hartshorn was literally ripe for Rutherford to just bring on board and here, go. Writing that early in it, he was. I'm wondering if he had some influence on Rutherford. His ear, hey, check this out. Hey, check this out. Well, go ahead. You're going to comment on that?
We're going to go a little bit into Hartshorn's history here in just a little bit here, and see how much of an influence he may have been on Rutherford. But we do see some of these threads by various writers in various periodicals that are in that Watchtower organization at the time.
In preparing and reviewing this, we missed a lot that we're catching now in all this as we're going along and talking about it.
There's a letter by Hartshorn to Russell in the June 15th, 1911 Watchtower. And he says, wherever I go among college men or others, I find present truth permeating remarkably. Able financial and businessmen conceding that an unparalleled panic is coming. So what businessmen was he talking to in the other article? Or
Jewish,
claiming he was talking to?
The Rothschilds, the Jewish.
That's what he's claiming, yeah. So we'll get a little bit more of that in a little bit. Hartshorn is actually a famous guy. He was in the Civil War, and his diaries are in a museum. A lot of his drawings of the Civil War as well. One source of visual documentation, and this is from the Rauner Library. It says, one source of visual documentation in Rauner's collection is the diary of Newton T. Hartshorn. Hartshorn enlisted as a private in U.S. Engineer Corps in 1861. His diary provides a wonderful written account of his life in the services, but also includes a number of sketches depicting the daily life of a soldier. His sketches include camp life, scenic views, patriotic imagery, and the advance to Bull Run. Hartshorn was eventually promoted to captain in the War Department Rifles, where he was assigned to the White House as part of President Lincoln's Guard. But not when Lincoln was assassinated. He was not the Guard then. Hartshorn had also drawn a very famous picture of President Grant that many might recognize there as well. Here's another article by Hartshorn. A fake Christ would be smooth. So, another Hartshorn article in the Golden Age of November 10th, 1920. And this one's on Bolshevism. So he's linking the Bolshevist communist conspiracies to that Rothschild's plot. And remember, our KKK John Bonet, he sent a conspiratorial article to Hartshorn, who just ran with it in the Golden Age. This is coming also from Bonet. Bonet's involved in this as well. And he had a lot of influence with Rutherford as well. It says the newspapers are afraid to publish what the Watchtower publishes about big business. Why? Evidently, the meaning of the word Bolshevism as applied in Russia is government solely by the working class in the interest of the working class. Hence, the underlying principle of Bolshevism is government by a class in interest of a class. Some years since in London, in discussing American politics, one of the heads of the greatest baking house in the world said to me, and we know he was talking about Rothschilds again, or again, he's claiming this is what Rothschild says. You do not have popular government in the United States. The people do not rule. Money rules. The New York agent of that banking house, who is also the agent of the British government in the United States, was for 14 years the chairman of our national committee of one of the two great political parties which have elected the president of the United States for 50 years past. Evidently, the English baron aforementioned was good authority in the kind of government which we have here in the United States. I couldn't verify any of this.
Mm-hmm.
It's so bizarre. It's definitely lays in the conspiratorial thinking. There's
remember,
you could say something's true, but where's the documentation for it?
A lot of early stuff like Woodworth, they just wrote crazy things that came off the top of their head. Exaggerating, looking for attention. My question, let's say, why would Rothschild sit and have dinner with him and then, we control it all, and gloat like that with him? If anything, he'd keep his mouth shut and smile, thinking to himself, yeah.
If it's a secret, it's not such a secret.
Yeah, exactly.
It just seems bizarre to me. Yeah, very, very strange.
Or it was, another bank, just a banker, and he created it being the Rothschild. There's just a lot of questions in that. And we'll get into more of this later with some secret letters going out.
So again, on the right-hand side here is another clipping from this article by Hartshorn. It says, the big daily is afraid. Another case of subsidized press is before us. They positively will not publish anything contrary to the big business. Here's the evidence. In the Golden Age for November 10th, Newton T. Hartshorn states he attended a meeting of the Industrial Department of the Interchurch World Movement as a correspondent to a leading American newspaper. He secured a verbatim report of Reverend Fred B. Fisher's speech. Dr. Fisher is the secretary of this movement and was sent abroad to make a personal investigation and came back making his report before the officials. Mr. Hartshorn could not get this report printed, neither does he know of any paper that did publish the report. The Enterprise carried this report in full in its issue of November 30th. This report, made almost a year ago, was sent to us by Pilgrim Brother Bonnet. Where we got it from, we don't know, as it came to us typewritten. If it takes the activity of the Bible students to let such things leak out, why let it come this or that way? We are not surprised at it. Bible students, are the only ones in the light. All others are in the dark, stupefied and dazed with the wine of Babylon's mixture. So even the wisest of the wise, who do not reverence God and know something of his plan, cannot see the truth shall make you free.
And we're seeing some early glimpses of only us. You got to come to us. Only the Golden Age, only the Watchtower has what you need to read. They're not telling you. It's just us.
All right.
And
I like this one because it says Well, we don't have any independent verification of it because it's not in any newspaper. You know, Brother Bonnet gave it to us. Where he got it from, we don't know. I look for this. I look for this everywhere. I can't find it anywhere, not in any of the newspapers.
I was going to get with that, with Bonnet's statement, all that about finding this thing.
This interchurch movement that this person has supposedly had spoken of, we have a report of that, at least, in the Presbyterian Handbook. He was a Presbyterian. And it says, expect 1,000 at an interchurch gathering. And it kind of gives a little outline there of what they were talking about. There's nothing like that anywhere. There's really no report. So where Bonnet got it from? How do you verify something like that? And so they just published it without fact-checking the source.
But this is what I was going to say. But what you're doing is you're attracting a type of people who like those type of mysteries and theories and all that. So they're attracting people who would actually, even back then, join something, become part of something without fact checking, without realizing what it was. Yeah, let's run with it. Oh, he said it. Oh, well, just like you said, there's no source of it, but they published it anyway. Who's going to read stuff like that? Who's
going to check it out like that?
We will.
We are. There's actually a report about this gathering as well. The Interchurch World Movement of North America, the findings of the World Survey Conference, January 7th to 10th, 1920. And that Fred B. Fisher is listed as being on the committee, report of the committee, the Financial Ingathering. His picture is in the book. But again, there's nothing like that in that program.
Okay, so
where Bonnet got it from?
Is there a picture of Bonnet or that Northorn, however you pronounce it? Are there pictures of him with the Rothschilds or receipts from the restaurant where they were eating the same day, an autograph, something? Is there anything like that out there?
Let's see if I can Photoshop something together real quick.
Yes.
All right. And so now we're going to take a more refined focus on some of these Watchtower conspiracy theories that they were looking at. Knowing what we know now about the theories that were going around at the time,